Thanks for joining us for our inaugural webinar today. We're going to be setting these up as a running series, ideally monthly, but given how things go, it may wind up being every 6 weeks or so. Just a brief note on format. These sessions will be iterative, just as any ideal process improvement should be, meaning that we will learn and build on things like format, Q&As, and adapt those as needed to make sure we're bringing you what you want out of these sessions. So for today, we've got this set up as just a chat, a Zoom chat. We've got the chat activated. That means I'll try to keep an eye on the chat module and review questions as they come in. We also have a member of our team, Vincent, with us today. Vincent will keep an eye on the chat as well and bump up anything to me that needs to be bumped up in case I'm not able to see it. Finally, as a note, if you've got some team members who may want to view this, we are recording this session and I'll make the recording available to everybody. Beyond just the recording, I'm also happy to rerun the session geared toward your particular team without charge. Just drop a note in the chat or reach out to me following the session and we can coordinate scheduling. So just a touch of expectation setting for today. We are designing these as bite-sized sessions. Process improvement is a deep subject, so we can only cover so much territory in 30 minutes. It's not a bad thing if this session leaves you hungry for a bit more. That said, I don't want anyone disappointed thinking you're going to learn everything there is to know about process improvement over one lunch. In fact, I run an 8-week program that just about scratches the surface. So for today, I think we can expect to introduce some topics and set up some definitions as our takeaway. Today's topic, of course, is process improvement, bridging the gap between good, cheap, and fast. As shown in our little animation here, the adage is generally that you can have something good and cheap, but not fast. Or you can have it good and fast, but not cheap. Or you can have it fast and cheap, but not good. Clients expect to get all three, but they're usually lucky to get 2 out of the 3. This adage tends to hold up, particularly in many skilled trades like carpenters, electricians, and classic car restorations. Areas where you can still work efficiently, but require some particularly specialized skills that either require taking the time or paying for those skills. Personally, I once made the mistake of hiring the lowest bidding electrician. He was done with that job cheap and fast. I then spent the next 3 weeks having his work redone at a substantially greater cost than I originally would have had. I also think about a neighbor of mine who has a 1964 Impala convertible. He has been getting this thing restored for the last 5 years. I'm pretty sure that he expects a level of perfection that may not exist. And I'm also pretty certain that he's put a small fortune into that thing. So for our purposes today, we are setting aside those skilled tradespeople and really talking about small businesses and office environments. And while my focus is generally on small law firms, the discussion today is really applicable to most of those small businesses. So we can appreciate anecdotally why there is this toggle among good, fast, and cheap, and why you may never get all 3 simultaneously. But why is it realistically such a challenge to balance these? Primarily because these 3 objectives often have conflicting demands. They compete with each other, making it difficult to optimize all those aspects at once. So let's break down exactly why they compete with each other. And it may sound elementary, but in order to have any decent improvement project, you always need to have a consistency in terms and an understanding of those terms across your teams. So first, let's take a look at the good. For sake of completeness, by good, we mean quality. What is it about quality that could compete with the other factors? If you have some ideas and feel like you want to enter something in the chat, go ahead and do so, and we'll take a look at those. But for our purposes, really, high quality products or services generally require more time and resources for development and production, particularly in your upfront setup, or if you have a once-off project, something that may not be scalable or repeatable. But that's really a whole other issue for a whole other webinar. So what's another issue? Ensuring consistently high levels of quality often requires rigorous testing, quality control measures. This invariably slows down your processes and increase costs. Again, especially in the setup phases, but it remains true even as a project moves forward because continuous improvement is always an iterative process. So what's one of the downsides of striving for solely the highest quality? Well, in some cases, this can lead to over-engineering, resulting in unnecessary complexity, extra expense, and potential performance issue. A classic example of this over-engineering is this little guy, Clippy. Everyone's most despised office helper. Clippy is a classically over-designed user interface. In theory, the concept was good. Microsoft wanted a unique and high-quality interface. But in their perverse efforts to keep the interface simple, they made the background so overwrought and overly complex that poor Clippy didn't have a chance. The interface was supposed to predict what a user is working on and offer suggestions on how to make that work better or how to format it more simply. The downside was that Clippy, for being a helper, was not very helpful. His advice, I'm assuming it's him, but the advice and formatting suggestions he gave was regrettably rudimentary, and they just weren't the user's time. You could make them more helpful, but in Microsoft's effort to keep it simple, they kept Clippy purposely way too simple on the front end. On the back end, there was a more meaningful way to engage with Clippy, but in order to do so, the user had to dive deep into menus that were often hidden and purposely hidden, adding another layer of unnecessary complexity. Again, these menus were hidden in an effort to keep it simple for the average user, but one of the other more frustrating aspects of Clippy was that he was overly intrusive. He would pop up incessantly, interrupting your workflow, and you just couldn't get rid of him. So finally, on top of all that, Clippy was an absolute resource hog. Because he had all this animation and really was one of the early attempts at contextual awareness, it created just this level of complexity that Microsoft just kept making more and more complex, meaning that Clippy in the end was known for crashing more than a few computers. So next, let's take a look at cheap. So here, obviously, we're talking about costs and keeping costs to a minimum. If anybody's got some thoughts on some of the issues with that, feel free to enter them in the chat if you like. But some of the issues that we see with focusing solely on costs may be obvious. Cost reduction efforts sometimes do compromise quality, especially if those cost reduction efforts rely on cheaper materials or shortcutted, I should say, processes, which result in inferior end results. Cutting costs can often also lead to reduced investments in employee training, infrastructure, technology, because those are usually the areas that get cut first. And in the end, this can negatively impact your overall efficiency and your effectiveness. So in addition to that, a lot of times you'll wind up choosing the cheapest suppliers or vendors, and that can also result in lower quality outputs. These are just some of the risks of solely pursuing costs. And an example of cheaping out is this beaut, the Ford Pinto. A true statement of the Ford Pinto is that it was developed with a relentless focus on costs. This was the result of that singular focus on costs, this beautiful vehicle you see right here. And we'll get to that problem in just a second. I want to check the chat. I see there was a couple of comments there. Lisa, you get what you pay for. Bauer, good equals increased time and possibility over engineered equals increased cost, whereas process standardization equals scale equals volume equals reduced cost. Very nicely said, Bauer. Like that, like both of those. Thank you, Vincent, for raising that. So what was the main problem with this beautiful Ford Pinto? They
Other
blew
than the
up.
color, you mean?
Other than that color, yeah. They blew up, and a lot of them blew up. A very minor issue for a compact family vehicle. So what was some of the background to this? Well, the Pinto was designed as Ford's response to the VW Beetle, the Chevy Vega, the AMC Gremlin. And throughout their development, Ford's goal was really fueled by pressure from the competition in this brand new compact car segment. And their primary driving force was to create this competitive, small, affordable vehicle. And their focus, they had two focuses. One was, or rather foci, was speed to market, but their overlying focus was cost. They were driven by a relentless focus on cost. And that put them focusing really in that cheap area of that Venn diagram we had up before. That pushed them to make some decisions that, to put it mildly, compromise safety. The most critical safety issue, of course, was that the design of the fuel tank made it vulnerable to rupture anytime the car got rear-ended. And sometimes it took just a little tap, by the way. Ford engineers were completely aware of the safety concerns about this design during the Pinto's development and production, but they decided to proceed with it as is. Ford performed cost-benefit analyses, as any good finance people would do. They would force this to the engineers and tell them, no. But they discovered it would cost about $11 per vehicle to make the gas tank safer. And that $11 equated to about 0.5% of the vehicle's total starting price. In today's dollars, that would equate about $76 per car to fix it. In total, it would have cost Ford $14.3 million to run the recall, or about $98.3 million in 2023 dollars. Ford decided that instead of spending the money to make the car safer, it would be more cost effective to pay out the lawsuits for any injuries or deaths resulting from accidents. By the way, if you look at the headline at the top here, the news article from 1973, by the way, the date of some of those memos for the cost reduction, they had record profits in 1973. And tragically, that decision resulted in numerous severe injuries and even deaths. Countless investigations and lawsuits later, Ford did run a recall in '78, but the cost of that recall and all the settlements, not to mention the reputational cost, wound up costing Ford exponentially more than they originally were trying to save. And I just see something is in the chat, so let's take a look here. And Pinto had a self-igniting switch in the behind. Yeah, that is all too terribly true. So the true cost in the end of that focus on cost was, again, exponentially more than they would have originally spent. So finally, let's take a look at the fast aspect or the speed of the project. And what is it about the speed of a project that causes issues? Well, rushing through processes to meet tight deadlines can lead to errors and decreased quality, as well as expedited production often requires overtime pay, rush shipping, or additional resources, which can lead to increased costs. Also, focusing solely on speed can neglect the need for strategic planning or optimization of your processes, which ultimately leads to inefficiencies in the long run. And there are no shortage of examples of companies focusing solely on speed, usually seen by rushing a product to market. One of the more recent and egregious examples of this is this company, led by Elizabeth Holmes, her revolutionary blood testing company, Theranos. For about a decade, she and her leadership acted in great haste to get her Edison product to market, but didn't want to wait for sufficient testing or regulatory approval. Just as a quick side note, Edison was a device that was going to fill a nano container, which is basically a pinprick of blood, and be able to run hundreds of tests off of that versus the standard blood draw, which would take vials of blood and also require days worth of running the tests. This was supposed to get hundreds of tests from a pinprick and have it within minutes. The trouble is they didn't wait for testing. They didn't wait for regulatory approval. That didn't stop them from raising about $750 million at an ultimate valuation of $10 billion. And they also were able to convince companies like Walgreens and Safeway to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a product that not only didn't perform as advertised, it barely existed, meaning that Theranos rushed to market without even having a minimum viable product. If anybody's ever read the book or seen some of the movies on this, the product that they presented is ultimately laughable. We don't have the time to get fully deep into it, but look it up. It's quite interesting. The company collapsed virtually overnight once it was uncovered by a Wall Street Journal article. And Holmes' personal net worth dropped from $4.5 billion and appearing on the cover of Inc. and Fortune and Forbes to zero in a matter of days. She got a new record in terms of the quickest drop from being on the billionaires list. There are some other great examples of rushing to market. Some of these are well known, like New Coke, or the Crystal Pepsi disasters, which these are both business school fodder. Lisa, I know at Kellogg, both you and I certainly got into Crystal Pepsi as well as New Coke. These are examples of how not to bring a product to market. Yet there are some other rushes to market, and these are just for fun. Some of these are lesser known and hopefully for good reason. But some of my favorite rushes to market include Cheetos lip balm, because who doesn't want the Cheeto dust spread all over their lips for everyone to enjoy? And another favorite, Colgate beef lasagna, because who doesn't want to equate brushing their teeth with eating beef lasagna? So not sure who greenlit these products, but really it's quite amazing that these were rushed to market. So now we're pretty much all on the same page in terms of the definitions of our three prongs of our dilemma. But what are some of the trade-offs that keep us from getting all three? And one of those, of course, is that, as we've talked about, we've got resource constraints. So while we're trying to keep costs low, delivering quickly, that requires significant allocations of resources. Small businesses have limited resources. Our time, our money, our people are finite, and it's an ongoing challenge to allocate them optimally. Implementing process improvement to achieve better balance might face resistance. I say might, and I'm saying that mildly sarcastically. Might face resistance from employees who are comfortable with the status quo. I work with a lot of law firms, and for example, the barriers are usually the attorneys. Attorneys like things the way they are, and they like working the way they're doing things because that's the way they have always done things. So balancing good, fast, and cheap means making those trade-offs, and a lot of times you have to prioritize, because remember, when you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to another. And depending on who you're talking to, your client, your bank, your accountant, your employees, they will all have different perspectives on what is most important. This doesn't even talk about what's going on outside your company. Market conditions, customer preferences, and regulations can be changing rapidly, making it a challenge to maintain that balance between good, cheap, and fast over time. So how does process improvement bridge that gap? In a broader sense, we are talking about simple efficiency, but to get to simple efficiency is sometimes not so simple. Let's start by defining the general term. What do I mean when I say process improvement? Definitionally, and brace yourself, it's a mouthful. Process improvement refers to the systematic approach of identifying, analyzing, and implementing changes to enhance the efficiency, effectiveness, and overall performance of a specific process within an organization. If you can't tell, I was reading that because that's typically the definition that you see out there in the world. But I think it's most important to look at the goals of what you're trying to do. The primary goal of process improvement is to optimize your workflows, reduce your waste, minimize your errors, and increase your productivity while also delivering a better outcome. Process improvement often involves a combination of methodologies. So this is the how you get to it. And this involves tools such as Six Sigma, Lean, Kaizen, total quality management, business process reengineering, and various data-driven techniques, including one of my favorites, design thinking. These all emphasize collaboration, data analysis, and continuous learning to achieve ongoing enhancements within your processes. The ultimate goal, of course, is to reach that point of higher efficiency, cost reduction, and overall organizational growth. And I'm going to just pause for a second. I see something in the Bauer. How do you decide if process is really about improvement or for process sake? Great question. We're gonna wind up getting a little bit to that, Bauer, because that's a great point, because we do see a lot of times having process for process sake, and that really it kind of defeats the purpose. So we're gonna come back. We'll loop back to that one in just a couple minutes. Because I think this next piece, where we're going to talk through the standard improvement methodology. And by the way, a lot of purists are going to flame me for this because they have their own set of definitions. But generally speaking, a lot of these methodologies follow a plan, do, check, act cycle, which generally means you're planning, you're identifying your processes that require improvement. You're setting your specific goals and objectives for your improvement. You're developing a strategy or action plan to achieve those goals. Planning is a big one. And Barbara, this is exactly what you were starting to raise. Where you're going to identify if you have a process improvement for process improvement's sake or a process for process sake is in this planning phase primarily. Because this is where you're going to align your organization's goals with whatever improvements that you need to have out there. Goals are a big driver in any process improvement strategy. There's a lot of theories that say start at the end and work your way back. That's also one of the things we're doing here. So planning is a big thing, and that's going to be where you spend most of your time. And honestly, when you do a lessons learned on any failed initiatives, this is frequently the area that you see where something went wrong. The doing portion of this is where you're implementing your plan changes in a controlled manner. This involves testing and piloting those proposed improvements on a small scale before your full-scale implementation. Your check, this is where you're measuring, evaluating the impact of those changes that you made during do. You're analyzing your data, you're setting up performance metrics and checking them rigorously to see if you're actually being effective. And I would say, Barbara, this is the second area where you're going to decide if your process improvement is really having the weight it should, where you're checking your metrics, making sure that everything you're looking at is aligning with your set goals. And finally is your act. So this is where, based on your evaluation, you're going to start implementing. You're going to decide whether you're going to adopt, modify, or reject. And if you're successful, this is where you're going to standardize the changes and integrate them into your regular processes. And if anything falls short, you're going to start back over at the plan and keep moving forward. And also another important aspect of this is always checking your metrics and acting on any anomalies or downtrends, as well as honestly making sure you're celebrating any of your uptrends, because you've went through this whole process. You ought to be able to celebrate when things are going well. So I brought back this fun little animation, which we had before, is what are some of the benefits of process improvement? These will be a little bit obvious, but again, it's important to get all of our terms together. Customers frequently are demanding rapid delivery. This butts up against cost-cutting measures. That leads to compromises in quality frequently. Trying to keep your quality high while still being fast and cost efficient can frequently backfire. But if you're building out standardized, repeatable, measurable processes, it heavily mitigates that compromise. It's always important to remember that no matter what, your team members are your most precious resources. Pushing them too hard to achieve fast service with either limited or, frankly, no additional resources can put quite a strain on employees. They work long hours, they've got excessive workloads, they burn out. Optimizing your resources, standardizing workloads, standardizing workflows tends to relieve a lot of those last-minute requests, relieves a lot of work interruptions, makes scheduling a little more predictable. Customer satisfaction. As we've already established, customers are always going to push for more and more and more. Managing those expectations while still trying to stay profitable is a real challenge. But if you're operating efficiently with systems that put your customer at the center of your process, and by the way, that's one of the ideas of design thinking, is really putting your customer at the center of your process. You naturally increase your communication with your customers. You create a world where you're able to get and implement regular feedback. This helps take the guesswork out of trying to achieve what you want for your customers. And honestly, it helps build out data in case, I'm sure no one has ever had this before, but you occasionally get out of line feedback from a client, something that's just not true, something that they're pointing the finger, throwing you under the bus for. If you can come armed with data, it helps address that feedback so much more effectively. Again, not saying anyone's ever been in that space, but here we are. Supply chain management is another big one. If you're able to predict your supplies and other resource needs, it definitely becomes easier in a predictable process. You can ensure timely deliverables. You can ensure minimize resource costs if you can plan all those things out. Balancing out all these objectives is an ongoing process. As we talked about before, markets, technologies, and customer demands evolve. Continuous improvement efforts help maintain that balance and help keep up with the evolution. By the way, continuous improvement could be its own session and probably will be. So for now, we're just going to improve it or introduce it here. We'll talk about it down the line at some point in a future webinar. So wanted to talk about a success story. I see Lisa laughing because I think this is another Kellogg gem here. But Lego, more than just the stabber of parents' feet, Lego is one of the most iconic toy brands in the world and is also a real success story in terms of turning around an organization. It's not as well known, but in the early 2000s, despite their place in the market, profits were sinking, expenses were skyrocketing, and their pipeline was looking grim. Their target markets were aging. They were no longer that into Legos. They were dated. They were way too complicated. And so Lego went on an effort to simplify their operations. They did this massive corporate-wide reorganization. They cut costs, they refocused marketing, overhauled their organizational and manufacturing processes. One of the things too is Lego had way too many different elements and components that complicated their inventory management. It gave them production challenges. So they simplified their product range. They standardized brick sizes. They reduced the number of unique pieces. That made their operations inherently more efficient. Lego embraced agile methodologies that emphasized iterative development and continuous feedback. They were no longer relying on a traditional linear development process. They adopted a more flexible approach that allowed them to make incremental improvements and also adjust throughout the development cycle. Lego also introduced a modular design approach, which allowed them to develop new products from standard element and components. This not only facilitated faster product development, it also made it easier to incorporate fan ideas and suggestions, tie into movies. You see that one's from Lego Movie. I think that's the Batman edition. Another fun thing that modularity gave them, side note, especially for any parents who have preschool kids flexing between Duplo and Lego blocks, as I do. If you look at the lower right picture, not sure if you ever knew this, but Duplo blocks fit into these smaller scale Lego blocks. That just blew my mind the first time I discovered it. But you can stack all of the Legos exactly. Blew my mind. So in the end, Lego really visualized the entire development process that pinpointed the areas that required that needed improvement. They optimized their workflow. They used a lot of this by using value stream mapping. They reduced the non-value adding activities in their development. This also gave them the ability to get faster to market with new products. They had better alignment with customer preferences. They had an overall increase in quality and appeal of their offerings. And what does this all sound like? They moved closer and closer to good, cheap, and fast. So the Lego example kind of ties things together for all of us here. Now, I am not saying that your projects will be as comprehensive as Lego's, but they could have similar results, albeit maybe on a smaller scale, but you still can implement the features of the process reorganization plan they implemented by reviewing your goals, aligning with your goals, and aligning your goals with your needs and existing resources, planning your future state, implementing testing, and measuring your performance. You get closer to good, fast, and cheap. An important note, as I just put up there on the screen, is that these projects take time. There are no quick fixes and there are no magic beans. Regardless of what tech solution is being presented to you, there is still real work to be done. I don't want everyone to think there's all doom and gloom though, because while it is a fair amount of work, it is an investment in the future, and it does follow a logical approach. You start by cleaning your house. You talk about your goals. You get alignment and buy-in on those goals. Find evangelists, find influencers, get them on board early. You map out your project, but don't be afraid to shift your map as you learn. And remember, these projects are iterative. Learn and test and keep moving forward. Find your minds and diffuse them before they explode. Also, as I mentioned before, celebrate your wins. This is important because these projects seem gargantuan at times. And if you're at least celebrating incremental steps, incremental progress, it does make a difference. And finally, test, test, test. This is a big thing that I have to stress with all the attorneys I work with, because they are afraid of change, generally speaking. Again, not to generalize, but I'll generalize and say they're afraid of change. When I stress to them that I'm not just going to go in and slap something into the office, but that we test and we make changes on the testing, that gives them much more comfort. So yeah, test, test, test before you ever deploy. And so as a final thought today, and again, very much appreciate your time today, what is one of the biggest issues facing firms looking to address process improvement? Generally speaking, they don't know what they don't know. And this is why data becomes so important. Process improvement needs to be a data-driven methodology. Each of those methodologies we introduced before, whether you're using Lean, Six Sigma, PDCA, design thinking, they have the potential to dramatically improve your productivity and profitability. But the reality is that too many businesses jump into improvement without taking the time to do the pre-work. By the way, this is an introduction and a semi-plug for our September webinar because, as we mentioned just a moment ago, getting your house cleaned and assembling the data you need to make thoughtful decisions before you start a project is going to be our next webinar in September. It is also critical to your success because it allows you to focus on what you actually need to work on, not what you think should be worked on. And I think that's something that people are always surprised on when they start to look at the data, whether it's calendar audits or just data in general. So I know we're a bit over time as we were scheduled, but I really appreciate everyone's time. I know some of you have to leave at the half hour, and that's totally cool. Really appreciate your time today. I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions if you have them. We can take those now. Otherwise, a big thank you from the 80/20 team. And so if you have any questions now, happy to stay on. Otherwise, I will send out to you a link to this webinar today. We've recorded it, so I'll send that along to everybody. And I'll send that along with all the contact information, and feel free to follow up with any questions we have. So again, thank you very much. Appreciate your time today, and have a great rest of your day.